What if the most explosive feud of the last decade wasn't driven by hatred at all? What if the shouting, the walk-offs, the viral outrage, the slammed tables and burning bridges were never the point? What if all of it was cover? Because there's something deeply unsettling about the way this story actually unfolded. Something that doesn't fit the neat narrative most people accepted. Something that only becomes obvious when you stop watching the spectacle and start watching the silences. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The pauses, the moments that never made the clip reels. Ask yourself this: why do some public feuds feel alive long after the reason for them is supposedly gone? Why do certain names get repeated with a kind of emotional intensity that goes beyond criticism, beyond even anger? And why do the people closest to those at the center of the storm so often say nothing at all? Tonight, we're not here to rehash tabloid headlines. We're here to examine a media war, a psychological one. A war fought with airtime, narrative framing, obsession disguised as principle, and silence wielded like a weapon. At the center of it all, Piers Morgan and Meghan Markle. Two figures locked in what the public was told was pure unfiltered animosity. But animosity doesn't usually behave like this. Animosity cools. It fades. It finds a new target. This didn't. Instead, it escalated, mutated, reappeared at odd moments, shifted tone, changed costume, became louder when it should have gone quiet, and went strangely quiet when it should have exploded. And then there's the third figure almost no one talks about. Not because she isn't visible, but because she refuses to perform. Celia Walden. A journalist, a writer, a woman who understands narrative mechanics better than most people in the room, and someone who, by virtue of proximity alone, saw a version of this story the public never did. This is not a story about romance. It's not a story about secret meetings or hidden rooms. It's something far more modern, far more dangerous. It's about attention, power, and the way media conflict can become a mutually sustaining ecosystem. Because here's the first uncomfortable truth. Feuds don't survive without fuel. And fuel doesn't come from hatred alone. It comes from relevance, from reaction, from an audience trained to believe that the loudest voice is always the most honest one. Let's rewind. Before the walk-offs, before the viral clips, before the dramatic resignations and social media pylons. Back to when this feud was still something else entirely. Back to when it didn't look like war. Back to when it looked, personal, not in a romantic sense, in a psychological one, because there's a difference between criticizing someone's actions and centering your public identity around them. Watch the footage again, the early interviews, the tone, the language. Listen not just to what's said, but how often a single name appears. How many analogies revolve around one person. How outrage keeps circling back to the same gravitational center. Ask yourself, why this figure? Why not the institution? Why not the system? Why not the broader culture? Why does the narrative keep collapsing back into one individual? That's not how ideological opposition usually works. That's how fixation works. And fixation is rarely one-sided. Here's where the media war really begins. Not when the feud goes public, but when both sides realize something at roughly the same time. Attention is currency. Outrage is oxygen. And conflict, when performed well, is endlessly renewable. This is where the story stops being about right and wrong and starts being about leverage. Every televised rant creates a counter-narrative. Every counter-narrative creates another segment. Every segment pulls in viewers, clicks, reactions, defenders, critics. The machine feeds itself. And once it does, stepping away becomes dangerous. Because silence doesn't just end conflict. Silence collapses relevance. Now pause. Think about the moments when silence should have happened. Moments when a line was crossed. When a statement went too far. When escalation should have triggered disengagement. But instead, it triggered amplification, more airtime, more framing, more obsession, masquerading as accountability. This is where the psychological stakes rise, because at some point, the feud stops being about the original grievance. It becomes about control of the story. Who defines who? Who gets the final word? Who frames the other as villain, manipulator, fraud, narcissist, liar? And who gets believed? Here's the contradiction most people missed. Both sides benefited. One side benefited from positioning themselves as a truth-teller unafraid to speak. The other benefited from positioning themselves as a victim of an unfair media machine. Each narrative required the other to stay alive. Remove one, and the story collapses. This is why the feud couldn't end quietly. This is why it had to end explosively. On live television. With a walk-off. With moral absolutes. With lines drawn so clearly the audience wouldn't notice what was missing. Nuance. Now let's talk about Celia. Because while the cameras focused on performance, someone else was watching patterns. A journalist married to a man whose career thrives on narrative warfare, a woman trained not to react but to observe. Think about that position for a moment. Imagine hearing the same name come up again and again. Imagine watching outrage spike, dip, then spike again, always on cue. Imagine noticing how certain topics light a fuse instantly, while others pass with indifference. Imagine recognizing the difference between spontaneous anger and rehearsed indignation. Celia never inserted herself into the story. That alone is telling. In an era where visibility equals power, she chose absence. Not denial, not defense. Absence. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is information. Especially when it comes from someone who knows exactly how narratives are constructed. So ask yourself, what does a journalist hear that an audience doesn't? What does someone close enough to the machinery notice that viewers miss? Timing. Emotional tells. Shifts in language. Moments where anger feels performative rather than reactive. Moments where the outrage sounds tired. And then there are the contradictions. Public disdain paired with private familiarity, harsh language paired with deep, contextual knowledge, criticism that goes beyond policy or behavior and slips into character assassination. That kind of rhetoric doesn't come from distance. It comes from proximity, from investment, from something unresolved, and unresolved tension is the most powerful fuel of all. This is why the feud never felt clean, why it felt messy, overheated, personal, why it kept returning long after the audience expected closure, why it ended a job but not the fixation, and why, even after the loudest rupture, the story refused to die. Here's the question no one wanted to ask out loud. What if the feud wasn't a breakdown? What if it was the system working exactly as designed? A media environment where conflict is monetized, where outrage is rewarded, where emotional extremes are more valuable than truth, where walking away looks like integrity, but also guarantees immortality, and where silence from certain people speaks louder than screaming ever could. This is not about secret relationships. It's about mirrored dependency, a public clash that fed two narratives at once, a war that made everyone involved more visible, more discussed, more powerful, until the cost became too high. Because there is always a cost. It shows up in exhaustion, in strained relationships, in moments when the performance can't fully mask the pressure anymore. And this is where the story turns. Because at some point, someone stops asking how to win and starts asking how to survive. Someone close enough to the center to feel the heat. Someone who understands that narratives don't just consume audiences. They consume the people who create them. And that brings us to the moment where observation turns into realization, where silence becomes a decision, where the question is no longer who's right, but how much longer can this continue? Because once you see the pattern, once you recognize the war beneath the feud, you can't unsee it. And what came next would quietly reshape everything, even though almost no one noticed it happening. Why do some people shout the loudest about the things they claim to care about the least? That's the question we need to sit with before anything else. Because if you start this story where most people do, with the walk-off, the outrage, the explosive headlines, you miss the quieter signals that came long before the cameras rolled and the volume spiked. The truth is, this media war didn't begin with anger. It began with attention, not the casual kind, not the professional kind, but the kind that lingers, the kind that repeats, the kind that keeps circling back to the same name even when the news cycle has moved on. This chapter isn't about villains and heroes. It's about patterns, and the first pattern worth examining belongs to a man whose entire public identity has been built around confrontation. Piers Morgan has made a career out of outrage. That's not a criticism, it's a fact. Debate, provocation, confrontation, these are the tools of his trade. He understands better than most how attention works in the modern media ecosystem. Which is exactly why this story is so strange. Because seasoned media operators don't usually get stuck on one person. They pivot, they escalate, they move on. Unless something deeper is happening. Go back to the early phase of this saga, before the palace drama reached its peak, before the public had been trained to pick sides, before social media turned every disagreement into a tribal war. Listen to the language, not the insults, not the conclusions, the focus. How often one individual became the centerpiece of commentary. How critiques that could have been broad, about institutions, systems, privilege, media narratives, kept collapsing into a fixation on one person, Meghan Markle, again and again. Ask yourself this: how many public figures criticize the monarchy without becoming someone's long-term obsession? Plenty. So why this one? Here's where people get uncomfortable. Because obsession doesn't always look like admiration. Sometimes it looks like outrage with stamina, anger that refuses to fade, criticism that escalates instead of resolving. Think about the emotional energy required to sustain that level of engagement. This wasn't a single segment. It wasn't a fleeting comment. It was repetition, revisiting, reframing, returning to the same subject long after its immediate relevance had passed. That's not how casual disdain behaves. That's how unresolved tension behaves. And tension, in media terms, is incredibly valuable. Because tension keeps audiences engaged. It keeps narratives alive. It keeps the storyteller relevant. But here's the contradiction. Morgan didn't need this feud to stay relevant. He already had the platform, the audience, the clout, which raises a more unsettling possibility. What if relevance wasn't the motive? What if control was? Every media war has an unspoken goal, not just to criticize, but to define, to frame the other person so completely that alternative interpretations feel impossible. Watch the structure of the arguments. How often they moved beyond actions and into character. How frequently the language implied intention rather than outcome. How confidently motives were assigned. That level of certainty doesn't come from distance. It comes from emotional investment. An emotional investment, when combined with a public platform, can become something else entirely. A feedback loop. Outrage produces attention. Attention produces response. Response produces more outrage. The cycle sustains itself. Now let's talk about the moments when the cycle should have broken. There were plenty moments when the story could have cooled. When silence would have been the strategic move. When disengagement would have signaled closure, but instead of cooling, the temperature rose. Instead of silence, there was amplification. Instead of distance, there was escalation. This is where many viewers misread what they were seeing. They thought they were watching loss of control. In reality, they were watching mastery collide with obsession. Because Morgan knows how television works. He knows outrage is a performance. He knows escalation creates headlines. And he knows when to walk away. Which makes the eventual walk-off so fascinating, because it wasn't just dramatic. It was symbolic, a public rupture that did two things at once. It framed him as a man unwilling to compromise his principles, and it guaranteed the feud would never end quietly. Walking away doesn't end a story, it immortalizes it. The walk-off became a punctuation mark, a moment viewers could replay, argue over, choose sides about. It locked the narrative in place, and narratives, once locked, are incredibly hard to dismantle. But here's the detail almost no one noticed at the time. After the walk-off, the fixation didn't disappear. It transformed. The tone shifted. The framing evolved, but the subject remained. That's not coincidence. That's dependency. And dependency in media warfare is dangerous because it ties your identity to someone else's existence. If they fade, you lose a central antagonist. If they change, you must adjust your narrative. If they disappear entirely, the war ends. And wars are hard to walk away from once they become profitable. This is why media wars rarely end with reconciliation. They end with exhaustion. And exhaustion produces mistakes, slip-ups, moments when the mask cracks, moments when the outrage feels less righteous and more rehearsed. Watch closely and you'll see it. The repetition of talking points, the recycling of phrases, the emotional intensity that feels just slightly out of sync with the trigger. These are signs of a narrative that's running on momentum rather than fresh fuel. And that's where the psychological dimension becomes unavoidable. Because when outrage becomes habitual, it stops being about the target. It becomes about the self, about maintaining identity, about sustaining relevance, about winning a war that no longer has clear terms. Now ask yourself this. If this was truly about accountability, why didn't it end when accountability was supposedly achieved? Why didn't the story move on to new targets? Why did the language remain personal? Why did the emotional charge remain high? Why did silence from the other side provoke louder reactions rather than closure? Silence is the enemy of outrage, because silence refuses to validate the conflict. And yet, silence kept being answered with more noise. This is where the war stops looking symmetrical, because one side increasingly used absence as strategy, while the other used presence as weapon. And weapons, when used too often, lose their precision. They become blunt, predictable, desperate. This is the moment when observers closest to the center start noticing something is wrong. When repetition replaces insight. When outrage replaces analysis. When fixation replaces argument. And this is also the moment when the people in the room, but not on camera, begin to feel the strain. Because media wars aren't fought in isolation. They bleed into homes, into relationships, into late-night conversations that never make headlines. Which brings us to the figure who has remained conspicuously absent from this entire spectacle, Celia Walden. While the war raged publicly, she did something radical. She stayed quiet, no counterstatements, no defensive interviews, no performative solidarity, just absence. For a journalist, absence is rarely accidental. It's intentional, it's observational. It's a choice, and choices made in silence often carry more weight than statements made on camera. Imagine being in that position, watching a narrative consume your household, watching outrage cycle endlessly, watching the same name resurface again and again, watching emotional energy drain without resolution. Journalists are trained to spot patterns, to notice when a story is no longer advancing but merely repeating, to recognize when outrage has crossed the line from reaction to ritual. So ask yourself, what would you see from that vantage point? What would feel off? What moments would make you pause? What questions would you stop asking out loud and start asking internally? Because no media war stays external forever. Eventually, it turns inward. And when it does, the cost becomes personal. This chapter isn't about proving intent. It's about recognizing structure. A structure where outrage fed relevance, where relevance fed obsession, where obsession required escalation, and where escalation eventually demanded a sacrifice. The walk-off looked like that sacrifice, but it wasn't the end. It was the pivot, because after that moment, the war didn't disappear. It went underground. The tone softened. The language shifted, but the fixation remained. And when fixation remains without an outlet, something else fills the gap. Reflection, doubt, and, sometimes, realization. Realization that a story you helped create is now bigger than you, that the war you fueled no longer needs you to survive, and that stepping back won't stop it. It will only change how it unfolds. This is the moment when media wars become most dangerous, when control slips, when the narrative resists manipulation, when the people closest to the fire feel the heat most intensely, because the next phase of this story isn't about shouting, it's about observation, about timelines, about contradictions that no longer stay hidden once you know where to look. And the next chapter begins when someone starts paying attention not to what's being said, but to when it's being said, and what that timing reveals. Because what came next didn't explode on television. It unfolded quietly, methodically, in patterns that only make sense once you stop watching the performance and start watching the clock. Before the titles, before the palace gates, before the relentless spotlight that would come to define her public image. There's a version of this story that almost no one revisits, not because it's hidden, but because it doesn't fit the simplified narrative people were encouraged to accept. And that's exactly why we need to start here. Because if chapter 1 was about obsession masquerading as principle, then this chapter is about perception masquerading as reality. Here's the uncomfortable question that reframes everything. What if the media war didn't begin when Meghan entered the royal family, but when she proved she understood how media power actually works? Long before royal protocol, long before televised interviews, long before the world decided who she was supposed to be, Meghan Markle did something that many people in traditional media found deeply unsettling. She didn't play the role they expected, and more importantly, she didn't need them the way they were used to being needed. That matters, because media systems thrive on dependency. Access for coverage, coverage for legitimacy, legitimacy for influence. Break that chain, and the system reacts, not always loudly at first. Sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with skepticism, sometimes with subtle resistance disguised as concern. Meghan's early public persona was carefully constructed, not in a manipulative sense, but in a controlled one. She spoke in narratives. She framed her story with intention. She emphasized values over gossip. She leaned into causes that existed outside tabloid logic. That doesn't sound controversial now, but at the time it disrupted expectations. Because women entering elite spaces are often expected to perform gratitude first and autonomy second. She reversed that order. And reversal is threatening. Now pause. This isn't about liking her or disliking her. It's about recognizing how power reacts when it senses loss of control. Because once Meghan entered the public conversation, something strange happened. She became a projection surface. Different groups saw different things. A disruptor, an opportunist, a symbol, a scapegoat, a threat, a savior, rarely a human being. And media wars don't ignite around people who are easy to categorize. They ignite around people who refuse to stay in the box. This is where the early tension begins. Not as hatred, as friction. The kind of friction that builds when someone understands how narratives are built and refuses to let others build them for her. Interviews mattered. Word choice mattered. Timing mattered. Silence mattered. And that last one, silence, is where things get interesting. Because Meghan learned early something many public figures never grasp. You don't have to answer every provocation. You don't have to react to every headline. Sometimes the most destabilizing move is refusing to perform. Traditional media hates that. Because outrage requires response. Conflict requires participation. Without participation, the story loses oxygen. But what happens when one side keeps performing and the other side keeps withholding? That imbalance doesn't neutralize conflict. It intensifies it, because absence invites speculation. Silence gets filled by louder voices, and louder voices tend to exaggerate. Now connect this to what we saw in Chapter 1, an outrage-driven media personality repeatedly returning to the same subject. A target that rarely responds directly. A feedback loop with only one visible speaker. That's not a debate. That's a monologue with an audience. And monologues are dangerous when they go unchecked, because they begin to substitute repetition for evidence, emotion for argument, certainty for complexity. Here's where timing becomes crucial. When Meghan began stepping back from traditional media engagement, the intensity didn't drop, it rose. That's the opposite of how accountability narratives usually behave. Normally, silence signals disengagement. In this case, silence triggered escalation. More segments, more commentary, more moral framing. Ask yourself why. Why does one person's refusal to engage provoke such persistent reaction? The answer lies in control. If you can't influence the subject, you influence the audience. And if you can't extract response, you extract attention. That's how media wars mutate. Now let's talk about contradiction. Because while Meghan was increasingly framed as manipulative, calculating, overly media savvy, she was also accused of being naive, unprepared, overwhelmed. Those two things can't coexist. You can't be a master manipulator and clueless at the same time. But contradictions don't weaken media narratives. They strengthen them because they allow critics to pivot depending on what moment requires. When strength is visible, it's framed as threat. When vulnerability is visible, it's framed as weakness. Either way, the narrative holds. And narratives that hold regardless of evidence are not narratives. They're myths. This is where the psychological element becomes impossible to ignore. Myths don't need proof. They need repetition. And repetition needs a platform. Which brings us back to the war. One side reducing engagement, the other side increasing volume. One side leveraging silence, the other side leveraging outrage. This is not a coincidence, it's asymmetry. And asymmetry creates tension, especially when the quieter side continues to command attention simply by existing. Every absence becomes a provocation. Every refusal to engage becomes an insult. Every boundary becomes a challenge. And that's when tone shifts. From critique to obsession, watch the language carefully. Early criticism focuses on behavior. Later criticism focuses on character. Later still, it focuses on intention. That progression is revealing because when someone feels they're losing narrative control, they stop arguing facts and start assigning motives. They tell audiences what to think someone is really doing, why they're really silent, what they really want. That's not journalism. That's storytelling. And storytelling, when weaponized, becomes psychological warfare. Now imagine watching all of this from close proximity, not as an audience member, but from inside the room, where you hear the rehearsals, the frustrations, the circular conversations, the moments when outrage sounds tired but keeps going anyway. This is where Celia's role becomes unavoidable. Celia Walden isn't just a spouse. She's a professional observer, someone trained to separate signal from noise, someone who understands when a story is evolving and when it's stagnating. From her vantage point, this wasn't just a feud, it was a pattern where one figure became an emotional focal point long after the justification for that focus had expired, where silence from the subject didn't diffuse the conflict but fed it, where absence became the loudest presence in the room. Now consider this. What happens when someone like Celia starts noticing that the outrage never resolves, that the story never advances, that the arguments loop, that the emotional spikes arrive on schedule? What happens when you realize the war has become self-sustaining? Because at that moment, the question changes. It's no longer, is this criticism fair? It becomes, why can't this stop? And once you ask that, everything shifts. Because wars that can't stop aren't driven by principle. They're driven by need. The need to perform. The need to remain relevant. The need to keep the narrative alive even when it no longer serves truth. This is where Meghan's pre-palace instincts matter most. She understood something early. You don't win media wars by shouting. You win them by choosing when not to speak. And that choice infuriates people who rely on reaction. It destabilizes their rhythm. It exposes their dependency, and it forces them to escalate to maintain momentum, which is exactly what happened. The war didn't escalate because of new information. It escalated because of diminishing returns, because outrage was no longer producing the emotional payoff it once did. And when that happens, narratives become harsher. Edges sharpen, lines harden, moral certainty replaces inquiry, and the audience is pushed to choose sides. That's when the cost becomes real, not just publicly, privately, because obsession doesn't stay on screen. It follows people home, into conversations, into silences, into relationships. And that's where the next shift occurs, because at some point, someone stops watching the performance and starts tracking the patterns underneath it. dates, timelines, intervals, the rhythm of outrage, the gaps between reactions, the moments when silence lasts just long enough to trigger another explosion. Those details don't show up in headlines, but they show up clearly to anyone paying attention. And the moment someone begins tracking time instead of tone, the entire story looks different. Because what came next wasn't about what was said, it was about when it was said, and how those moments lined up in ways no one publicly explained. What if the anger you're watching isn't anger at all? What if it's choreography? Because there's a moment in every prolonged public feud where the emotions stop behaving like emotions and start behaving like a script. The beats become predictable. The outrage lands on cue. The pauses stretch just long enough to invite speculation, then snap back into noise. That's the moment when hatred becomes theater. And theater has rules. Open strong. Escalate fast. Repeat the central conflict. Never resolve it. If Chapter 2 was about silence as strategy, this chapter is about performance as survival. Let's talk about how media conflict turns into a stage play, and why audiences rarely notice when it happens. Start with a simple observation. Real anger burns hot and burns out. Performative anger burns clean and burns forever. It's sustained by reaction, not resolution. Look at the cadence of this feud, the timing of the segments, the repetition of phrases, the familiar framing devices. It's not chaotic, it's rhythmic, which should immediately raise a question. If this is pure emotion, why does it follow such a reliable structure? The answer lies in incentives. Modern media doesn't reward nuance. It rewards certainty. Outrage framed as moral clarity. Opposition framed as betrayal. And once a conflict generates consistent engagement, it becomes valuable, not just financially, psychologically, because it gives the performer something crucial: a role. Roles are comforting. They simplify the world. They tell you who you are and who you're fighting, and they eliminate ambiguity. But here's the trap. Once you accept the role, you have to keep playing it. Watch how the feud evolved once it reached peak visibility. Early commentary focused on specific moments, interviews, statements, decisions. Later commentary focused on identity, character, intent, moral worth. That shift is not accidental. It's theatrical escalation, because theater needs stakes. And when factual stakes diminish, emotional stakes take over. Now pause and think like a producer. If you're booking a segment, what's more compelling? A careful analysis of institutional dynamics, or a clear villain and a clear hero? Audiences don't just watch conflict. They audition for it. They pick sides. They argue in comments. They share clips. They become part of the show. This is where media wars become collaborative. The audience stops being a witness and becomes a participant. And once that happens, stepping off the stage feels like betrayal, not just to viewers, but to the role you've built. Now consider the asymmetry again. One side participates fully in the theater. The other side refuses to take the stage. That creates imbalance. The performer needs a counterpart. Without one, the performance looks excessive. So what happens? The performer exaggerates, raises the volume, sharpens the language, adds moral framing. The goal isn't persuasion anymore. It's validation. Validation that the role still matters, that the audience is still watching, that the war is still worth fighting. This is why the feud began to feel repetitive, not because nothing was happening, but because the same dramatic beats were being replayed. Outrage, reaction, amplification, silence, outrage again. That's a loop. And loops are addictive. They give the illusion of movement without requiring change. Now let's talk about irony, because the most ironic part of this entire media war is this: the louder one side performed hostility, the more power the silent side gained. Why? Because silence invites projection. Audiences fill the gap with their own interpretations. Supporters see restraint. Critics see guilt. Neutrals see mystery. Mystery sustains interest, and interest sustains relevance. This is why attempts to end the story failed. Every attempt to land a final blow only refreshed the narrative. Every attempt to force closure only extended the run. The theater demanded continuation. Now imagine watching this from inside the house, not as a viewer, but as someone living with the performer, someone who understands how scripts are written, someone who recognizes when emotion is being summoned on command, someone who notices when outrage appears at predictable intervals. This is where Celia's silence becomes crucial. Celia Walden didn't step into the spotlight to clarify or defend. She didn't counter-program. She didn't offer behind-the-scenes explanations. She didn't soften the edges. She did something far more destabilizing. She refused to participate. For a journalist, that's not neutrality. That's observation. And observation changes the power dynamic, because once someone stops playing their assigned role, the script begins to wobble. The performer starts compensating, filling space, reasserting narrative dominance, repeating points more forcefully. That's when the theater starts to show its seams. You see it in body language, in overemphasis, in the way jokes become sharper, in the way moral certainty hardens into contempt. This isn't about intent. It's about consequence. When conflict becomes a performance, the truth becomes secondary to the act, and the act must go on. But here's the part that almost no one noticed. The audience started changing. Early viewers tuned in for analysis. Later viewers tuned in for spectacle. That shift matters, because spectacle has a shorter shelf life. It demands escalation, bigger claims, stronger language, clearer villains. That pressure doesn't come from the subject of the feud. It comes from the format, and formats shape behavior. This is where the walk-off becomes more than a dramatic moment. It becomes a structural necessity, the ultimate theatrical gesture, a refusal that is itself a performance. Walking away on camera doesn't end a show. It creates mythology. It allows the performer to exit while freezing the narrative at its most dramatic point. No resolution, no reconciliation, just rupture. And rupture invites endless interpretation, but the walk-off also marks something else. The moment when the theater begins to collapse under its own weight. Because once you leave the stage, you lose control of how the audience interprets your exit. Some see integrity, some see avoidance. Some see martyrdom, some see exhaustion. And once interpretation fragments, control weakens. That's when the war enters its next phase. Not louder, quieter, more subtle, more obsessed with timing than tone. Because when theater no longer guarantees dominance, strategists start watching the clock. They track when stories break, when silence ends, when reactions land. They look for patterns, intervals, triggers. This is where the conflict stops being about who's right and starts being about who controls the tempo. Tempo is power, the ability to set the rhythm of attention, the ability to decide when the audience leans in and when they move on. And once tempo becomes the battleground, everything changes, because tempo is invisible. It doesn't trend, it doesn't go viral, but it dictates everything underneath the noise. Someone was watching that tempo closely. Someone who understood that repetition wasn't strength anymore, that escalation was producing diminishing returns, that the theater had reached saturation, and that the only way forward was to understand the pattern beneath the performance. Because once you understand the pattern, you can predict the next move. And when you can predict the next move, the war stops feeling chaotic. It starts feeling inevitable. And that inevitability leads to the most dangerous realization of all, that the feud isn't being driven by new information, it's being driven by habit. And habits, once recognized, can be disrupted. But disruption doesn't come from shouting. It comes from timing, from noticing when outrage spikes, from asking why it spikes then, and not earlier, from seeing the gaps no one talks about. Those gaps are where the real story lives, and in the next chapter, we're going to step fully into those gaps. We're going to stop watching the performance and start tracking the timeline. Because once the dates stop lining up neatly, the entire media war begins to look very different. What does it look like to witness a war from inside the room without ever firing a shot? This chapter is about the person everyone overlooked while the cameras were rolling and the commentary spun itself into frenzy. The spouse, the observer, the quiet presence who understood more than anyone because she wasn't performing. She was watching. Celia Walden. While the world focused on public outrage, televised walk-offs, and social media storms, she was absorbing patterns, timing, repetition, intensity, the mechanics of a feud that had escalated beyond mere disagreement. She didn't interrupt, she didn't justify, she didn't validate, and in doing so, she became an invisible anchor in a sea of chaos. Ask yourself, how often do you see a person's silence carry more weight than their words? In the theater of conflict, silence is a weapon. Silence is information. Silence reveals what performance hides. And when wielded strategically, silence exposes vulnerabilities in the most carefully crafted narrative. Let's set the scene. It's late at night. Discussions that seem casual are anything but. Television clips play on repeat. Headlines are dissected aloud. Every moment is analyzed, reframed, and positioned as evidence of guilt, incompetence, or miscalculation. And yet, Celia says almost nothing. Not because she's passive, not because she's unaware, but because she understands the stakes. Media wars are tricky. The louder you react, the more oxygen you give the fire. The quieter you remain, the more the fire burns in strange, unpredictable ways. And from inside that room, the patterns are clear. The first thing she notices is rhythm, the repetition of outrage, the timing of statements, the intervals between segments. How emotion is dialed up in public, while in private, tension is measured, controlled, almost clinical. These aren't coincidences. These are rehearsed beats. Stage directions written not in scripts, but in human behavior, body language, and social expectation. The second thing she notices is escalation. It doesn't follow logic. It doesn't track events. It's a ladder of provocation designed to maintain attention. Every public insult is calculated to provoke not response, but visibility. Every critique is a magnet, drawing eyes, clicks, and reactions. And because one side refuses to engage, escalation becomes necessary. The performer inflates outrage, sharpens language, and leverages moral positioning to maintain dominance. Third is contradiction. Public denunciation paired with private familiarity. Harsh criticism contrasted with behind-the-scenes cooperation. Patterns that don't align with public claims. Observing these contradictions isn't just noticing inconsistencies, it's understanding intent without explicit proof. And intent is the secret weapon in a media war. Celia understands that. From her vantage point, it's a delicate game. One misstep and she could be drawn in. One word spoken, one interpretation offered, and she would become part of the story she's watching. That's why she chooses observation over intervention, analysis over assertion. The next thing she notices is dependency. The louder one side performs, the more they rely on the silent presence of the other to validate the story. Absence from the target doesn't neutralize outrage, it sustains it. Every refusal to engage acts as fuel, pushing the performer to escalate, refine, and repeat. Imagine living inside that. Every conversation feels loaded. Every silence is scrutinized. Every glance is measured for meaning. Emotional energy, exhausted on camera, leaks into private spaces, and someone has to hold it together, observe patterns, and avoid reaction. That person becomes the quiet strategist, the one invisible to the audience yet indispensable to understanding what is actually happening. Observation also reveals timing. Celia notices how certain topics trigger immediate response, while others are ignored. She sees that outrage isn't proportional to events, it's engineered. That's when the pattern emerges. The feedback loop becomes clear. Outrage, silence, reaction, amplification, repetition. A cycle sustained by habit, ego, and necessity. She also notices strain, not on camera, not in public, but in private. The weariness in conversations, the slight misalignments, the forced smiles. Media wars consume more than headlines. They consume human energy, relationships, and emotional stability. Witnessing it closely, one begins to see cracks in the facade, moments where performance falters and reality seeps through. Then there's strategy. Silence isn't passive. Observation isn't neutral. Both are active choices in a war where every statement is scrutinized. Celia understands that to step in is to risk escalation. To stay out is to allow patterns to reveal themselves. In media warfare, restraint is power, and sometimes the greatest influence comes not from noise but from absence. By analyzing rhythm, escalation, contradiction, dependency, and strain, she begins to map the conflict. She doesn't need confirmation. Patterns speak for themselves. The war isn't chaotic. It's predictable if you know how to read it. And here's the most unsettling realization of all. Patterns that seem predictable in theory become dangerous in practice. Because once you understand rhythm, escalation, and dependency, you realize that each performance is designed not just to provoke the audience, but to manipulate perception, to shape beliefs, to control the narrative. And the more predictable it becomes, the more tempting it is for someone to exploit that predictability. Celia's role becomes crucial, because if she observes, she sees what the audience cannot. The war beneath the war. The loops, the timing, the feedback. And once you see that, the entire story begins to shift. What looks like chaos is actually structure. What looks like hate is sometimes strategy. What looks like personal attack is often performance. And once structure, strategy, and performance are visible, the stakes increase. Because those patterns aren't harmless. They dictate outcomes, influence careers, shape public perception, and sometimes they make people question reality itself, what's genuine and what's orchestrated. She knows the stakes, and she waits. Because patience is a weapon in a theater fueled by repetition and dependence. One moment of miscalculation, one misinterpreted signal, and the narrative can collapse or explode in ways that no one anticipates. Her silence allows observation. Observation allows insight. Insight allows the next moves to be understood before they happen. And that is power. And that's why the next chapter isn't about what's spoken, it's about the timing of everything. The timeline, the sequence, the intervals between performances. Because once someone begins measuring the war in moments instead of words, the entire story takes on a new shape. What if the truth isn't hidden in what people say, but in when they say it? This is the moment where observation turns into investigation, where performance becomes traceable, where silence and speech are measured not as emotion, but as data points on a timeline. Because in a war fueled by repetition, timing is everything. When you watch the events unfold chronologically, something startling emerges. The public story presents itself as a straightforward sequence: interview, statement, rebuttal, outrage, viral clip, repeat. But when you dig deeper, when you map absences, appearances, and responses against one another, you begin to see gaps. Gaps that are too precise to be accidental. Gaps that suggest orchestration, intentional or otherwise. Start with public appearances. Each segment, each debate, each television panel is a beat. And every beat has a response. Media coverage, social media commentary, insider analysis, and often an echo of outrage that isn't directly triggered by the initial statement. That echo doesn't behave randomly. It comes at intervals, sometimes hours later, sometimes days later, always calculated to sustain momentum. But then there are the anomalies. Dates that don't line up, statements that are repeated in ways the public doesn't notice, contradictory accounts from different outlets that, when cross-referenced, reveal subtle but significant inconsistencies. Why does it matter? Because in media wars, inconsistencies aren't mistakes, they're signals. They indicate where control is lost, where narratives are being patched, and where someone behind the scenes is adjusting the tempo. Now, think about travel. Private trips, scheduled interviews, unannounced absences. When these are cross-referenced with public statements, they reveal something even more curious. A pattern emerges of moments when the subject was ostensibly inaccessible, yet reactions spiked. Outrage didn't subside, it intensified. This is impossible if the sequence were organic. It's as though the rhythm of the feud is maintained independent of the participants' availability. That's when the concept of dependency becomes unavoidable. One side's performance is dependent on the other's absence. The silence becomes fuel. The gaps are exploited. And each spike in attention reinforces the loop. Consider social media. A statement posted at 7:13 p.m., reshared at 8:05 p.m., followed by commentary at 8:30 p.m. The sequence repeats over multiple days. These intervals aren't accidental. They coincide with broadcast schedules, trending algorithms, and peak engagement times. Someone is orchestrating, not the story itself, but its amplification. And the more predictable the audience's behavior, the more precise the timing can be. The timeline also exposes contradictions between public narrative and private reality. Meetings that were reported as coincidental actually align with critical responses. Statements claimed to be spontaneous are preceded by similar phrasing in private notes or interviews elsewhere. Moments of surprise outrage were often preempted by subtle signals and off-camera behavior. Observation from within the inner circle, especially by someone trained to notice patterns, reveals these subtle alignments. It's when the timeline starts revealing the orchestration of both presence and absence that the psychological stakes spike. Because these are not simply public relations missteps, they are behavioral signals. Every appearance, every silence, every measured word contributes to the construction of a perception that the audience experiences as reality. And the longer it goes unnoticed, the more entrenched it becomes. Here's the revealing part. The more predictable the timeline, the easier it is for one side to anticipate the other's moves. They can plan escalation, they can calibrate outrage, they can manage attention. And if one participant has access to that sequence while remaining silent, they hold a form of power invisible to viewers but critical behind the scenes. And this is where patterns begin to feel almost mechanical. It's not passion driving the response. It's rhythm. It's the internal clock of a feud that has evolved beyond its initial triggers. Someone is measuring moments like pieces on a chessboard, predictable intervals, planned escalations, strategic silences. And when you see it, the illusion of spontaneity shatters. Because what feels like emotional truth to the audience is often a meticulously constructed rhythm designed to manipulate perception. Now, throw in the human element. Observing patterns isn't just about dates and times. It's about reading reactions, emotional spikes, facial expressions, word choice, the subtle micro-behaviors that betray when someone is performing, when someone is exhausted, and when someone is calculating their next move. From this vantage point, the conflict begins to look less like personal animosity and more like a machine, a living, breathing, self-sustaining ecosystem of attention, manipulation, and strategy. And inside that ecosystem, some participants hold power invisible to anyone watching. The power of observation, of timing, of knowing when the next beat will land. But here's where it gets even more compelling. Once timelines are mapped, gaps can be exploited. Absences become as significant as appearances. Delays in response become as meaningful as immediate rebuttals. And the pattern itself can be weaponized to manipulate public perception. It's a feedback loop turned into strategy. And for someone like Celia, the silent observer, these patterns were crystal clear. She could anticipate escalation. She could see where the loops would repeat. She could predict the rhythm that the public mistook for chaos. And that's the danger in recognizing a pattern too well. Because once you know the choreography, you understand not just the moves, but the consequences of each deviation. Each beat of the feud carries stakes. Miss a signal, and the narrative can spiral out of control. Respond at the wrong moment, and your silence is compromised. Overlook an interval, and the media ecosystem reacts unpredictably. Timing, it turns out, is not neutral. It's tactical. And once someone realizes that, the war is no longer just a performance. It's a game of control, influence, and manipulation. And in the next chapter, we will follow those signals, the messages, the glances, the indirect cues that the public never saw. Because the war wasn't fought only on television or in print, it was fought in subtleties that were invisible to most viewers. And what came next would prove that even small signals could ignite large consequences. What if the most revealing moments in a feud never appeared on television? What if the truth hides not in headlines, but in whispers? subtle signals, and fleeting gestures that only a careful observer can decode. This is the terrain of Chapter 6. Here, the war becomes less about what's said and more about how it's implied. The stage is silent. The audience is watching. And every message, every glance, every breadcrumb dropped in public or behind closed doors carries meaning far beyond the obvious. Begin with messages, not text messages you've seen leaked online, not public statements, but the ones that never made headlines, the notes, the tweets that were deleted, the indirect comments, the posts with double meanings. Every one of these was part of a rhythm that reinforced attention, provoked speculation, and subtly manipulated narrative flow. Why is this important? Because in media wars, content is currency, but context is power. A single offhand comment, a phrasing nuance, or a timing choice can fuel speculation for days. It is the space between words, the choice to delay a response, the decision to amplify one point while muting another, that tells you what the participants really care about. Glances matter too. On-camera expressions, public appearances where eye contact is fleeting, controlled, or exaggerated. There's a reason analysts study body language. A single look lingering, diverted, or pointed can convey defiance, recognition, acknowledgement, or dismissal without a single word being spoken. And in the theater of conflict, those glances are often more powerful than statements. Then there are the breadcrumbs, the subtle cues embedded in public appearances, media interviews, and casual remarks. They are almost invisible to anyone not paying attention. A phrase repeated across interviews, a reference that resurfaces in two different contexts, a joke delivered with timing that doesn't match the moment. These are the breadcrumbs that signal pattern, intention, or underlying tension. Consider how these operate together. A silent pause in a broadcast, paired with a cryptic tweet later that day, followed by a casual remark in print. It's all interconnected. Individually, each moment may seem trivial. Together, they create a network of influence, signaling to insiders, shaping audience perception, and reinforcing the emotional loop that sustains the feud. Now, let's explore contradictions. Public criticism often ran alongside private signals that suggested familiarity, awareness, or even respect. Messages designed to provoke outrage were sometimes sent to reach allies, reinforce loyalty, or test reaction. The dance between public provocation and private signaling creates tension because it obscures intent. Observers must decipher whether a statement is genuine anger, calculated positioning, or a combination of both. The observer inside the room, Celia Walden, has a unique vantage. She notices patterns invisible to the casual audience. She sees how repetition strengthens the narrative loop. She tracks how the timing of statements influences audience perception. She understands that these micro-behaviors are not random. They are signals in a game of influence. Here's where the stakes rise. Each breadcrumb carries potential consequences. Misinterpreted, it can amplify outrage. Overlooked, it can shift public perception. Each glance, each message, each subtle cue functions as both evidence and trigger in a complex feedback loop. Direct observation reveals even more. When a message is ignored by the intended recipient, it often prompts overcompensation elsewhere. When a glance is returned, it may reinforce hierarchy, influence, or expectation. When a cue is missed, misalignment occurs, sparking confusion, speculation, and, inevitably, more performance. This chapter is also about leverage. Every subtle signal carries potential for control. Public figures in conflict often underestimate the power of micro-behaviors. A deferred response, a fleeting acknowledgement, or a repeated phrasing can become a tool to shape perception without a word of argument. Those who notice and understand the signals, like Celia, hold silent but significant power. Now layer in the audience. Media consumers rarely notice these micro-patterns, but they react to them. The social media ecosystem amplifies them. Tweets are shared, phrases repeated, narratives reinforced, and the signals become embedded into public consciousness. Attention, again, becomes the oxygen sustaining the conflict. And here's a paradox. The more subtle the signal, the more potent its impact. A glance unnoticed by most is catastrophic if decoded by the right observer. A deleted message sparks speculation. A phrase repeated in context frames belief. The war is fought not just with statements, but with the invisible architecture of communication. The gaps, the timing, the gestures, the psychological dimension escalates. Participants are aware, consciously or not, of these patterns. They manipulate them. They exploit them. They anticipate reactions. They embed cues to test loyalty, provoke responses, or assert dominance. Observation, pattern recognition, and timing become more influential than words themselves. In this ecosystem, silence is never passive. Absence is active. Ignored cues are amplified. Each participant shapes not only their own narrative, but the perception of the other. This is where the war's complexity deepens. It is multi-layered, spanning public broadcast, private observation, social media reactions, and subtle micro-behaviors. And for the silent observer inside the room, the stakes are existential. Misreading a signal can shift alliances, misinterpret patterns, or allow manipulation to go unchecked. Recognition of the sequence grants insight, but also, knowing the rhythm of the war allows prediction, but it also makes one acutely aware of the next escalation, the next performance, the next cascade of public reaction. And so, the war continues, meticulously orchestrated, observed, and subtly manipulated, not with loud statements alone, but with the quiet architecture of messages, glances. What comes next is where the strategy becomes psychological, where obsession thrives under observation, and where the silent pattern finally begins to dictate outcomes more than public statements ever could. Why do some conflicts persist long after the reasons for them have faded? Why do certain people remain the center of attention, the object of repeated commentary, the target of relentless outrage, even when the original grievance has long since disappeared? The answer lies not in logic, and certainly not in fairness. It lies in psychology. Chapter 7 shifts from observation of patterns to understanding the human behaviors that sustain them. This is where obsession, identity, and strategy collide, creating a war that is as much mental as it is public. Consider the dynamics of obsession. Obsession isn't hatred. It isn't even necessarily personal. Obsession is fixation, a focus that persists beyond utility, that defies exhaustion. It is reinforced by repetition, validation, and the perception that influence or power depends on maintaining that focus. In media warfare, this fixation fuels content, drives engagement, and perpetuates conflict. One participant performs outrage consistently. Every segment, every social media post, every public commentary is crafted to sustain attention. It escalates moral framing, sharpens criticism, and highlights perceived wrongdoing. The intensity appears emotional, spontaneous, righteous, but carefully calibrated. It feeds on reaction, on silence, on the absence of counter-engagement. The other participant, meanwhile, withholds direct engagement. They do not escalate, but their silence amplifies the performance. Absence becomes fuel. Each non-response invites speculation, frustration, and interpretation. And every observer, including journalists, insiders, and even audiences, begins to fill in gaps, often incorrectly. Psychologically, this creates a loop. One side's performance is reinforced by the other's silence. One side's silence is meaningful because it triggers repeated attention. Emotional energy, instead of dissipating, is constantly renewed. The conflict sustains itself without new material. This loop is compounded by audience behavior. Audiences are not passive. They participate, interpret, and react. Social media accelerates this feedback. Tweets, shares, comments, likes, all become oxygen for the cycle. The more people react, the more energy feeds back into the performance. The war becomes multi-layered. Performer, observer, and audience, each influencing the other. Now add moral framing. Outrage, when sustained, publicly often assumes moral authority. Statements are no longer just criticism. They become declarations of right and wrong. The target's silence is recast as guilt, arrogance, or fear. This moral lens transforms routine disagreement into existential stakes. It makes every action or non-action meaningful, further escalating tension. Observation from within the inner circle reveals another dimension: anticipation. Participants start predicting each other's moves. They anticipate public response, social media reaction, and internal conversation. This forecasting shapes behavior, sometimes more than the original grievance. Actions are no longer reactive. They are preemptive, strategic, designed to manipulate perception as much as convey reality. Consider the impact on personal identity. For some participants, the feud becomes intertwined with self-conception. To maintain credibility, relevance, or authority, one must continue performing. To disengage would risk not just attention, but the identity that the conflict sustains. Obsession, therefore, is not just external. It is internal. It feeds ego, maintains status, and preserves control. And then there's the psychology of the silent observer. In this case, someone like Celia Walden. Observing a media war from the inside requires mental discipline, detachment, and pattern recognition. Every gesture, pause, message, and repeated phrase becomes data. The observer deciphers rhythms, anticipates escalation, and interprets inconsistencies. Awareness becomes power, but also burden. Understanding the machinery behind the conflict makes missteps impossible to ignore. Psychological pressure accumulates in multiple layers. Performance fatigue sets in. The sustained cycle of escalation and anticipation wears down participants. Misinterpretations occur. Emotional spikes and dips are measured. Yet human reaction is imperfect. Small cracks in strategy emerge. Yet these cracks are rarely seen by the public. They are only visible to the observer who watches both the performance and the mechanics behind it. This is why media wars that seem endless are often invisible wars of cognition. They are contests of attention, anticipation, and influence rather than objective truth. Participants jockey for control of perception. Observers map patterns and predict outcomes. Audiences participate unknowingly. And all of it occurs in an ecosystem where silence is as powerful as speech, timing is as influential as content, and repetition is the key to perceived authority. The psychology becomes even more layered when interpersonal dynamics intersect with strategic performance. Private relationships, loyalty rivalry, and perception management all influence the public output. Decisions are made not just for personal reasons, but to manipulate outcomes in the public sphere. Emotional states, personal investment, and reputation are all tools within a broader strategic framework. Here's the most revealing point. What appears irrational to the casual observer is often deeply rational to those who understand the war's mechanics. Escalation, repetition, and contradiction are not mistakes, they are intentional, designed to maintain control and influence. Yet paradoxically, the closer someone is to understanding the psychological architecture, the more vulnerable they become. Awareness exposes the manipulations, but it also exposes the observer to unintended consequences. Patterns reveal strategy, but also make the observer's decisions pivotal. One wrong interpretation, one misstep in timing, and the feedback loop can spiral unpredictably. This is where the war transcends the visible conflict. It becomes a cognitive ecosystem, a chessboard where each piece, speech, silence, message, glance, is moved not merely for effect but to shape perception and maintain control. Every participant, whether performer, target, or observer, is entangled in the rhythm. By understanding the psychological dimensions, it becomes clear why public outrage persisted long after the original causes had dissipated. The war was sustained by anticipation, obsession, and strategic calculation. It was no longer about who was right. It was about maintaining the war itself, ensuring that each beat of outrage reinforced the roles, the identities, and the narrative momentum. And yet, even as the machinery hums, there are signals that destabilize it. Unplanned events, subtle contradictions, and human unpredictability begin to inject friction. Observers, including those closest to the participants, recognize opportunities to disrupt cycles, anticipate escalation, and influence outcomes without overt intervention. At this point, the war is no longer just public. It is deeply psychological.